For 17 years, I maintained the Psychic Edicts archive on Terra with precision that earned 3 commendations and a transfer to the Restricted Historical Records Division. I cross-referenced Legion compliance reports against Iterators' doctrinal assessments, verified chronologies of the Great Crusade's most sensitive operations, and cataloged the documents that proved the Emperor's vision was singular and absolute. My superior, Lexiconum Secundus Varn, told me my faith made my classifications flawless. I believed him. I believed all of it. My name is Severin Ultis, Archivist 3rd Class of the Divisio Telepathica Historical Records Department, and I want you to understand this. I cataloged the evidence of my own indoctrination before I understood what I was reading. When I discovered a discrepancy in the chronology of Magnus's censure at Nicaea, when the dates refused to align no matter how many times I recalculated them, I thought I had found a clerical error. I was wrong. I had found a door I should never have opened. What lies behind it will make you question whether Magnus the Red's catastrophic betrayal was truly a failure of obedience, or something far more terrible, the fulfillment of the Emperor's unspoken will. The archive chamber where I worked was maintained at exactly 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to preserve parchment, cold enough that my breath misted when I spoke the daily prayer of record-keeping at the beginning of each shift. The chamber occupied sub-level 7 of the Forbidden Archives complex, 3 kilometers beneath the Terran surface, accessible only through gene-locked doors that required my handprint, retinal scan, and recitation of the Oath of Eternal Silence. I took pride in this. The trust implicit in my assignment felt like vindication of 2 decades of loyal service, proof that my dedication to the Imperial truth had been recognized and rewarded. My duties began each morning at the 6th bell of Terra's artificial dawn cycle. I would descend through the security checkpoints, strip to regulation archiveware to prevent contamination of the documents, and enter the temperature-controlled vault where 17,000 years of psychic prohibition doctrine was stored in climate-sealed cases. The air tasted of preservative oils and ancient parchment, a smell I had grown to associate with sacred duty. I would review my assignment slate, retrieve the designated documents using the correct handling protocols, and spend the next 12 hours cataloging, cross-referencing, and maintaining the chronological integrity of humanity's relationship with the Imperium. The work was meticulous. Each document required verification of its date, authentication of its seals, cross-reference against related materials, and proper categorization within the archival matrix. I processed approximately 40 documents per day, every day, for 17 years. I had handled over 200,000 historical records. I knew the evolution of Imperial psychic doctrine better than I knew my own childhood. I could recite the edicts of Nicaea from memory. I could trace the philosophical development from the Emperor's early embrace of psychers to his later prohibition, explaining each logical step that led to the Council's conclusions. I was good at my work because I believed in it. The Emperor had walked among psychers for millennia, had understood their power intimately, and had concluded through experience and wisdom that sorcery was too dangerous to permit. The Thousand Sons had been corrupted by their hubris. Magnus had defied explicit prohibition. The burning of Prospero had been tragic, but necessary. These were not opinions. They were documented facts I had personally verified through primary sources. My faith was not blind adherence to propaganda. It was rational certainty built on evidence I had examined with my own eyes and hands. When I trained new archivists, I would tell them this: doubt is healthy if it leads you to examine the evidence more carefully, and the evidence always confirms the Emperor's wisdom. I meant it. I had examined the evidence more carefully than almost anyone living, and it had only strengthened my faith. The archive was organized chronologically, beginning with the earliest recorded incidents of psychic phenomena during Old Night, proceeding through the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade's expansion, culminating in the Heresy and its aftermath. Section 17 contained the Magnus materials, everything related to the Crimson King, his Legion, and the events at Prospero. It was the second largest collection in the entire archive, surpassed only by the materials on the traitor War Master himself. This made sense. Magnus's fall had been pivotal. His shattering of the Webway Project had crippled humanity's future. Understanding his failure was essential to preventing similar tragedies. I had processed Magnus materials before, of course. In 17 years, I had handled perhaps 3,000 documents related to the 15th Legion. But my new assignment was different. Lexiconum Secundus Varn had summoned me to his office 37 days before everything changed. The office was warmer than the archives, maintained at 18 degrees, and smelled of countersigned parchment and the bitter recaf he drank constantly. He looked tired. He always looked tired. But that day the exhaustion seemed heavier, the shadows under his augmetic eyes deeper. He slid a data slate across his desk toward me. The gesture was casual, but his hand trembled slightly. I noticed this, but did not think it significant at the time. Many senior archivists developed tremors from decades of fine manipulation work. The data slate contained a list of documents I was to retrieve, verify, and prepare for transfer to the Inquisitorial archives, a routine task. The unusual part was the specificity. These were all documents created in the 5 years immediately preceding the Council of Nicaea, all related to the Emperor's direct communications with Magnus, and all classified at clearance level Obsidian Tertius or higher. "You'll need Inquisitorial countersignature for access," Varn said. His voice was flat, carefully neutral. "Inquisitor Crane has already approved your temporary elevation. The authorization is attached. You have 40 days to complete the processing. Work in Isolation Chamber 7. No assistance. No discussion of the materials outside the chamber. Standard protocol for obsidian materials." I had nodded, honored by the assignment. Obsidian classified materials were rare. To be trusted with them meant I had earned the confidence of the Inquisition itself. I asked if there was any particular focus for my verification process, any discrepancies I should watch for. Varn had looked at me for a long moment, his augmetic eyes clicking as they focused and refocused on my face. Then he said something I did not understand until much later. "Just maintain chronological accuracy. Dates are important. Make sure everything is in the correct sequence." He paused. "The truth of what happened depends on when things happened. Do you understand?" I said I did. I was wrong. The documents arrived in sealed cases over the next 3 days. 47 separate files, each containing between 12 and 90 individual documents. I established my workspace in Isolation Chamber 7, a smaller vault branching off the main archive, equipped with a single examination desk, proper lighting, and emergency Vox link to the security station. The temperature was maintained at 13 degrees, colder than the main archive. I did not question this. Colder meant better preservation. I began with the earliest materials, dated to 798 M30, approximately 4 years before Nicaea. These were transcripts of psychic communication between the Emperor and Magnus, recorded by designated remembrancers and verified by Malcador, the sigillary himself. The conversations were philosophical, discussing the nature of the great ocean, the proper role of psychic power in human civilization, and the dangers of uncontrolled warp craft. The Emperor's position was clear. Psychic power was a tool, potentially invaluable, but requiring rigorous discipline and strict boundaries. Magnus argued for broader exploration, faster development, greater acceptance of the Imperium's gifts. The disagreements were respectful but fundamental. I read these documents with the satisfaction of confirmation. Here was the evidence of Magnus's growing recklessness, the hubris that would lead to his downfall. The Emperor was patient, explanatory, attempting to guide his son toward wisdom. Magnus was brilliant but arrogant, convinced his genius could navigate dangers lesser minds could not. The narrative I expected was taking shape before me. Then I reached file 17, dated 801 about M30, and found the first wrongness. The document was a psychic transcript, formatted identically to the others I had processed. The Emperor and Magnus discussing theoretical limits of psychic projection through the Imperium. Technical material, complex enough that I had to reference several codex entries to fully comprehend the concepts. Nothing seemed unusual until I cross-referenced the date against the master chronology. According to the master records, Magnus the Red was not on Terra during the dates this conversation supposedly occurred. He was prosecuting compliance action on the world of Morningstar, 14 months of travel from the throne world, even by the fastest warp routes. I checked again. Then a third time. The discrepancy remained. This was not impossible, of course. Psychic communication did not require physical proximity. The Emperor and Magnus could have conversed across the void through psychic projection. But the document formatting suggested an in-person meeting, recorded by a remembrancer physically present in the room. The authentication seals confirmed this. Recorded in the Sanctum Imperialis, Terra, by remembrancer Ves Carlin, witnessed and verified. If Magnus was on Morningstar, how could a remembrancer on Terra have witnessed the conversation? I made a note in my verification log. Possible chronological error. Verify Magnus's location during period. I did not feel doubt yet, only professional diligence. Errors happened. 17,000 years of document handling meant occasional misfiling or miscatalogation. I would identify the mistake, correct it, and the archive's integrity would be maintained. This was my function. I continued working. Over the next 8 days, I processed 23 more files, finding the rhythm of the work soothing as always. The documents told the familiar story. Magnus's theories growing more radical, the Emperor's warnings becoming more explicit, the philosophical distance between them widening. I found 2 more chronological oddities, small discrepancies where dates didn't quite align with the master timeline, but nothing dramatic enough to disrupt the narrative arc. Then I opened file 31, dated 802M30, 6 months before Nicaea, and everything fractured. The document was an imperial edict, sealed with the Emperor's personal cipher, distributed to all legions through the Regent of Terra. The edict established preliminary restrictions on psychic practice ahead of the formal council, prohibiting certain classes of warp craft deemed preliminarily hazardous, and requiring all Legion librarians to submit to psychic evaluation before continuing their duties. Standard procedure for risk management. The document itself was unremarkable. What shattered me was the date on the distribution log. The edict was dated 802 to M30. The distribution log was dated 796 M30, 6 years earlier. The distribution had preceded the edict's creation by 6 years. I sat motionless at my examination desk, feeling the cold of the chamber seeping into my bones. I checked the dates again, certain I had misread. I had not. I examined the seals, looking for signs of forgery or alteration. There were none. Both documents were authentic, verified by multiple authorities, preserved in perfect condition. The dates were simply impossible. My hands were shaking slightly when I reached for the Vox link. I stopped myself. What would I say? That I had found an impossible chronology? That someone had distributed an edict 6 years before it was written? It sounded like madness, like the kind of obsessive minutia that archivists sometimes developed after too long in isolation. I had seen it happen to colleagues, the paranoid certainty that they had uncovered vast conspiracies in minor filing errors. I forced myself to consider rational explanations. Perhaps one document was mislabeled. Perhaps I had misread the dating system, mistaken a reference number for a chronological marker. Perhaps the distribution log referred to a different edict and had been misfiled with this one. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. I spent the next 4 hours checking every authentication marker, every seal, every verification code. I cross-referenced the documents against 3 separate chronological indices. I examined the parchment composition, the ink dating, the preservation condition. Everything confirmed what I did not want to believe. Both documents were authentic, correctly dated, and impossible. The distribution had preceded the creation by 6 years. I did not sleep that night. I returned to my HAB unit 17 levels above the archives and lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to construct explanations that would make the impossible possible. Perhaps the Emperor, in his infinite foresight, had dictated the edict to Malcador years before formalizing it, and the 802.M30 date reflected official publication rather than creation. Perhaps psychic precognition had been involved somehow. Perhaps the dating system I thought I understood had subtleties I had missed despite 17 years of experience. I wanted these explanations to satisfy me. They did not. The documents had been too clear, too specific. The edict had been created in 802.M30. The distribution had occurred in 796M30. No amount of rationalization could reverse time. When I returned to Isolation Chamber 7 the next morning, I made a decision that would destroy everything. Instead of continuing my assigned processing, I began pulling additional files from the Magnus collection, documents not on my assignment list, searching for context that would resolve the impossibility I had discovered. This was technically unauthorized, a minor violation of protocol, but I told myself I was ensuring accuracy. I was being thorough. I was doing my duty correctly. The second impossible thing I found was in a file dated 79999M30, 3 years before Nicaea. It was a report from Malcador to the Emperor, marked Eyes Only, Obsidian Maximus Clearance, discussing preparations for the coming council. The report detailed proposed restrictions on Legion librarian programs, recommended specific doctrinal positions to be formally adopted, and outlined the expected resistance from Magnus and his supporters. It was, essentially, the Nicaea verdict, written 3 years before the council convened. I read it twice. Then I retrieved the official Nicaea proceedings from the archive. The restrictions formally adopted at the council matched Malcador's report almost verbatim, down to specific phrasing in several clauses. This, too, was not impossible. The regent was wise beyond measure. He had likely anticipated the council's conclusions based on preliminary discussions, but the precision of the match troubled me. It felt less like prediction and more like script. I found the third wrongness in a document dated 794.M30. 8 years before Nicaea, 4 years before I had found any evidence of Magnus's supposed growing recklessness. It was a psychic transcript, another conversation between the Emperor and Magnus. In this document, the Emperor explicitly encouraged Magnus to continue his research into deeper warp craft, to explore the boundaries of what was possible, to push beyond the cautious limitations others might counsel. Your brothers see limits where you see possibilities, the Emperor had said, according to the transcript. Do not let their fears constrain your genius. The future I envision for humanity requires those willing to venture into unknown territories. I need you to be willing to take risks others will not. I sat back in my chair, the cold of the chamber suddenly feeling sharper. This did not match the narrative. The Emperor was supposed to have consistently warned Magnus away from dangerous research. That was the foundation of Magnus's guilt. He had defied explicit warnings, ignored direct prohibition. But here was the Emperor encouraging exactly the kind of exploration that would later be condemned as heresy. Perhaps the Emperor's position had changed as new dangers became apparent. Perhaps early encouragement had given way to later caution as the true risks of sorcery revealed themselves. This was possible. Wisdom meant adapting to new information. But then why had the edict restricting psychic practice been distributed 2 years before this conversation occurred? I began pulling more files, no longer following my assignment list, no longer maintaining proper protocol. I was searching for the pattern I could feel emerging, the shape of something vast and terrible that I did not yet want to name. Over the next 11 days, working 16 hours each day, surviving on ration bars and recaf brought to the isolation chamber, I assembled a chronology that should not have existed. In 794.M30, the Emperor had encouraged Magnus to push the boundaries of psychic research. In 796M30, restrictions on that research had been distributed to the legions. In 798M30, the Emperor had begun warning Magnus about the dangers of sorcery. In 799M30, Malcador had drafted the Nicaea verdict. In 801M30, the Emperor had engaged Magnus in philosophical debates about proper limitations on warpcraft. In 802M30, the preliminary restrictions had been formally published. In 803M30, the Council of Nicaea had convened and reached its verdict. The sequence was backwards. The conclusion had preceded the evidence. The restriction had preceded the warning. The verdict had preceded the trial. I felt something breaking inside my chest, a physical sensation like ribs cracking. I had spent 17 years maintaining the archives that proved the Emperor's wisdom. I had believed in the righteousness of the Thousand Sons' censure because the documents proved Magnus had been warned. had defied prohibition, had chosen damnation over obedience. But the documents, examined in proper chronological sequence, told a different story. Magnus had been encouraged to explore, then restricted, then warned, then judged. The prohibition Magnus violated had been created after the Emperor had explicitly encouraged him to pursue the same research. The council that condemned him had reached its verdict before it convened. I tried to rationalize this. Perhaps I was misunderstanding the documents. Perhaps the dates used different calendar systems I did not recognize. Perhaps the authentication seals were forged, though I had found no evidence of forgery. Perhaps I was losing my sanity, seeing patterns that did not exist. Construction conspiracies from coincidence. But I had spent 17 years learning to read these documents. I knew their formats, their verification systems, their preservation characteristics. I knew how to identify forgery and error. What I had found was neither. It was impossible truth. I reached file 47, the last in my assignment, and found the worst thing of all. It was a single sheet of parchment, sealed with the Emperor's personal cipher and countersigned by Malkador. The preservation was perfect, the authentication beyond question. It was dated 791 M30, 12 years before Nicaea, and it contained a single sentence in the Emperor's hand. Magnus will believe he acts against my will. This is necessary. I stared at those words until my vision blurred. I read them again and again. I tried to make them mean something other than what they obviously meant. I failed. Magnus will believe he acts against my will. This is necessary. The Emperor had known. Before the encouragement, before the restrictions, before the warnings, before the council, before the catastrophe, the Emperor had known that Magnus would act against his will and had deemed this necessary. I was shaking. The cold of the chambers seemed to be originating inside my body rather than from the ventilation system. I stood up from my examination desk and paced the small space, trying to force my mind to function rationally. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. Perhaps the Emperor had foreseen Magnus's fall through psychic precognition, and this was merely documentation of that foreknowledge. Perhaps necessary meant inevitably tragic, the acknowledgement that some catastrophes could not be prevented despite all efforts. But the chronology destroyed these comfortable interpretations. The Emperor had not merely foreseen Magnus's fall. He had created the conditions for it, encouraged exploration, then prohibited it, praised risk-taking, then condemned it as heresy, established the verdict before the trial. The entire architecture of Magnus's guilt had been constructed backwards, piece by piece, year by year. I returned to my hab unit that night and did not sleep. I lay in the darkness, trying to force the pieces into a configuration that preserved my faith, that allowed the Emperor to remain wise and righteous, that kept Magnus's fall a tragedy of disobedience rather than orchestration. I failed. Every arrangement I attempted collapsed under the weight of the chronology. The dates did not lie. The sequence was clear. Whatever had happened at Prospero, whatever catastrophe Magnus had triggered, it had not been a failure of the Emperor's plan. It had been the plan. The question that kept me awake, that burned through my mind like acid through parchment, was simple and terrible. Why? I returned to the archives the next morning with that question consuming me. I abandoned all pretense of following my assignment. I began pulling every document related to the Webway Project, every file discussing the Emperor's vision for humanity's future, every fragment of information about what Magnus's warning had actually accomplished when he psychically projected through the warp to reach Terra. The official narrative was simple. Magnus, desperate to warn the Emperor about Horus's treachery, had violated the prohibition against sorcery, used forbidden warp craft to pierce the psychic wards protecting Terra, and inadvertently shattered the Emperor's Webway Project. The Emperor's grand design for humanity's salvation had been destroyed by Magnus's hubris. Prospero burned as punishment. The Thousand Suns fell to chaos as consequence. The narrative was clear, tragic, and complete. But as I assembled the technical documents, the engineering specifications, the theoretical papers about the Webway's nature, a different picture emerged. The Webway was not simply a tunnel through reality that would protect humanity from warp travel. It was a psychic construct, maintained by constant concentration from the Emperor himself, requiring his perpetual attention and power to sustain. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, pouring his psychic might into holding open a passage through the Imperium. This much was known, part of the tragedy. Magnus's breach had forced the Emperor to remain upon the throne forever, unable to abandon his vigil lest the passage collapse entirely. What was not widely known, what I found in the deeper technical files, was that the Webway Project had required exponentially increasing psychic power to maintain as it grew. The early sections had been sustainable. The planned expansion would have required power beyond even the Emperor's capacity to sustain indefinitely. The mathematics were clear in the engineering reports. The Webway Project, at its planned scale, was not sustainable. It would eventually collapse under the weight of its own psychic requirements, or it would consume the Emperor entirely. I found a report from one of the project's chief architects, dated 799 M30, 4 years before Nicaea. The architect had calculated the maximum sustainable size of the Webway and concluded it was approximately 17% of the planned scope. To complete the full vision would require either multiple Emperor-equivalent psychic sources or a fundamental redesign of how the passages were maintained. Neither option appeared feasible with existing resources. The Emperor had been pursuing an impossible project. The Webway, as envisioned, could not be completed. I sat with this realization, feeling something cold settling in my stomach. An impossible project. A son encouraged to explore forbidden power, then prohibited from using it, then judged for using it despite prohibition. A catastrophe that shattered an already unsustainable design. I pulled the incident reports from the day Magnus's warning reached Terra. The official accounts described breach and devastation. Magnus's psychic projection had torn through the protective wards. Demons had poured through the gap. The Emperor had been forced to abandon the crusade to defend his Webway. Disaster. But the technical reports, the engineering logs written by the Mechanicum adepts maintaining the throne mechanisms, told a more precise story. Magnus's projection had indeed breached the wards. The psychic shields had collapsed, but the Webway tunnel itself had not been destroyed by the breach. It had begun collapsing 3 hours before Magnus's arrival, a structural failure propagating from the deepest sections where the psychic strain was greatest. The collapse had been catastrophic, irreversible, and according to the mathematics in the engineering logs, inevitable. Magnus's warning had not shattered the Webway. The Webway had shattered itself, and Magnus's arrival had occurred during the catastrophe. I sat in Isolation Chamber 7, surrounded by impossible documents, feeling the foundations of my faith crumbling like the Webway's deepest tunnels. I tried to tell myself I was misinterpreting. I tried to find alternative explanations. I failed. The chronology was clear. The Emperor had encouraged Magnus to develop dangerous psychic abilities. The Webway Project had been unsustainable. The prohibition against sorcery had been established before the encouragement. The verdict had preceded the trial. The Webway had collapsed on its own. Magnus's catastrophic breach had occurred after the collapse was already underway. Everything I believed was backwards. I thought about Magnus, desperate to warn his father of Horus's betrayal, using forbidden power because the alternative was watching the Imperium fall while he maintained obedience to arbitrary prohibition. I thought about Magnus, believing he was defying his father's will, carrying that guilt, that knowledge of his supposed failure. I thought about the Emperor's single sentence, "Magnus will believe he acts against my will." This is necessary. Why would it be necessary for Magnus to believe he had failed? I spent 3 more days in the archives, pulling files I had no authorization to access, violating every protocol I had ever followed. I found more pieces. I found reports about humanity's psychic awakening, the increasing percentage of psychers being born across the Imperium, the theoretical projections about what this meant for the species' future. I found the Emperor's private writings on controlled evolution, on directed development, on the necessity of forcing humanity towards psychic maturity, whether the species was ready or not. I found the core philosophy, documented in a text labeled "The Necessity of Transformation." It was written in the Emperor's own hand, dated 783 M30, before any of the Magnus materials began. The text argued that humanity's survival required rapid psychic evolution, that the nascent threats in the galaxy demanded humanity develop warp-resistant consciousness as quickly as possible, and that natural evolution was too slow. Transformation needed acceleration. Acceleration required catalysts. Catalysts required crises. A species evolves fastest under pressure, the Emperor had written. Fear drives adaptation. Loss drives innovation. Crisis drives transformation. To force humanity toward its necessary future, we must create the conditions that make evolution imperative. We must demonstrate the costs of psychic ignorance so dramatically that the alternative becomes obvious. I read that passage 17 times. I read the entire text 11 times. I cross-referenced it against every other document I had found. The pattern was complete. The Emperor had needed humanity to understand the danger of uncontrolled psychic power. He had needed to demonstrate what happened when even the most brilliant, most disciplined psyker fell to hubris. He had needed an example so catastrophic that the restrictions he planned to impose would be accepted as necessary, rather than tyrannical. He had needed a warning written in ashes and broken oaths. He had needed Magnus to fall, not because Magnus was corrupt, not because Magnus was weak, because Magnus was perfect, the most brilliant, most powerful, most devoted of the psychic primarchs. If even Magnus could fall, if even Magnus could catastrophically fail despite all his genius and discipline, then anyone could fall. Everyone needed restrictions. The prohibition would be justified by the example of its most spectacular violation. And the Webway collapse provided perfect timing. An unsustainable project, failing on its own, could be reframed as catastrophe caused by forbidden sorcery. The Emperor's inability to complete an impossible design could be transformed into heroic sacrifice, forced upon him by his son's disobedience. The failure of an unsustainable vision could become the tragedy of betrayal. Magnus will believe he acts against my will. This is necessary. Necessary because Magnus's guilt was essential. Necessary because the Crimson King needed to carry the weight of destruction he had not actually caused. Necessary because humanity's psychic evolution required a cautionary tale so powerful that it would echo through millennia. I sat in the cold of Isolation Chamber 7, 23 days into my 40-day assignment, and felt everything I had built my life upon disintegrate. I had spent 17 years maintaining the archives that proved the Emperor's wisdom. I had touched 200,000 documents. I had believed in the righteousness of the system because the evidence supported belief, and the evidence had been backwards from the beginning. The prohibition had preceded the crime. The verdict had preceded the trial. The fall had been orchestrated. Magnus had been encouraged to develop exactly the abilities he would later be condemned for using, prohibited from using them at precisely the moment when using them would appear catastrophic, and judged guilty for fulfilling the role designed for him. Everything had been backwards, and I had helped maintain the lie. I thought about Prospero. I had cataloged the reports of its burning, had filed the casualty assessments, had verified the justifications for its cleansing. The documents proved Magnus's guilt. They proved the necessity of the Space Wolves' intervention. They proved the righteous fury that had burned a world. But what had actually been destroyed at Prospero? A legion of psychers who had been encouraged to push boundaries, then told they were heretics for doing so. A culture built on the Emperor's early encouragement, condemned for taking his early teachings seriously. Librarians who had believed they were serving the Imperium's needs, executed for fulfilling a role they had been explicitly told to develop. The Thousand Sons had been sacrificed to prove a point. Their loyalty had been exploited, their devotion weaponized against them. They had been constructed as an example, developed as tools of demonstration, and then discarded when their pedagogical function was complete. I felt sick. The cold of the chamber was inside me now, spreading through my chest and stomach. I had maintained these archives. I had organized these documents. I had helped preserve the narrative that justified their burning. Every commendation I had earned, every mark of faith I had taken pride in, had been rewards for maintaining a lie I was too indoctrinated to recognize. I did not know what to do with this knowledge. I sat surrounded by impossible documents. feeling the weight of 17 years of complicity crushing down on me. I thought about reporting what I had found. I thought about bringing these chronological impossibilities to Lexicanum Secundus Varn, showing him the sequence, demanding explanation. And then I remembered Varn's trembling hand, his exhausted eyes, his careful neutrality when giving me the assignment. His specific instruction: make sure everything is in the correct sequence. The truth of what happened depends on when things happened. He had known what I would find. This was not an accident. I had been given exactly the documents necessary to discover the chronology's impossibility. I had been authorized to access Obsidian classified materials that revealed the pattern. I had been assigned to Isolation Chamber 7, alone, with 40 days to work through the implications. Someone wanted me to find this. Someone wanted me to understand. The question was why. I worked mechanically for the next 6 days, completing my official assignment while my mind spun through implications. I processed the remaining files, verified their contents, prepared them for transfer as instructed. I maintained proper protocols, completed proper documentation, acted as though I had found nothing unusual. I was good at my work. I had 17 years of practice at believing what I was told to believe. On the 37th day, as I was preparing to submit my final verification report, Lexicanum Secundus Varn summoned me to his office. The walk from Isolation Chamber 7 to his workspace normally took 11 minutes. That day, it felt like hours. I kept my face neutral, my movements calm. I had processed terrible knowledge before. I knew how to maintain composure while handling information that burned. Varn's office was warm as always. 18 degrees, the smell of recaf and countersigned parchment. He sat behind his desk, looking even more exhausted than I remembered, and gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. He studied me with those augmetic eyes, clicking and whirring as they focused. "You found the chronological discrepancies," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "All of them?" "I believe so." He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had expected. He reached into his desk and withdrew a data slate, placing it in front of me. "You should read this before we continue." I picked up the slate. The document displayed was dated 783.M30, older than most of the Magnus materials. It was a memorandum from Malcador to the Emperor, marked with seals that indicated clearance levels beyond Obsidian Maximus, classifications I had heard of but never thought I would encounter. The content was brief. "We proceed as discussed. The 15th Legion's trajectory is established. The outcome is prepared. When the moment arrives, we will have our cautionary tale. I do not know if this is right, but someone must be willing to architect humanity's necessary evolution. If there is guilt in this, I will carry it." I read it twice. My hands were steady. Everything inside me felt like it was breaking, but my hands were steady. I placed the data slate back on the desk and looked at Varn. He was watching me with something that might have been sympathy. "You understand now," he said quietly. "Magnus was set up," I said. My voice sounded distant, mechanical. The entire sequence was constructed backwards. The prohibition was established to be violated. The Webway's failure was reframed as Magnus's catastrophe. He was encouraged to develop the abilities he would be condemned for using, then punished for using them exactly as the design required. Varn nodded. "Yes. Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, the tone of someone who had wrestled with this question for longer than I had been alive. Humanity needed to fear psychers, needed restrictions to be accepted, needed the prohibition to feel justified rather than arbitrary. The Emperor understood that future threats required humanity to evolve psychically, but evolution without control would be extinction. The species needed to embrace warpcraft while fearing its dangers, needed to develop psychic power while maintaining discipline. He paused, closing his augmetic eyes briefly. That balance required demonstration, required an example so catastrophic that the prohibition became obvious. Magnus was the perfect tool, brilliant enough to be credible, powerful enough to be frightening, loyal enough to be tragic. The Emperor gave him everything needed to become the cautionary tale humanity required. "Prospero," I said. "The 1,000 Suns. Necessary casualties," Varn said. His voice cracked slightly on necessary. The Emperor's calculus operates on scales we struggle to comprehend. He thinks in millennia and species-wide outcomes. Individual tragedies, even Legion-scale tragedies, are variables in equations we barely understand. Was it right? He shook his head slowly. I don't know. I have maintained these archives for 93 years. I have asked that question every day for 93 years. I still do not know. I sat with this, feeling the cold from the archives spreading through every part of me. The Webway was always unsustainable, I said. Yes, the mathematics never worked. The Emperor knew this. He pursued it anyway because the pursuit served other purposes. The appearance of a grand salvation, the justification for demanding unity, the target that gave the Great Crusade urgency. Varn's hands trembled as he lifted his recaf. Some spilled over the rim. He did not seem to notice. When it failed, when the structural collapse began, Magnus's arrival provided perfect cover. The impossible project's failure became martyrdom. The Emperor's miscalculation became sacrifice forced upon him by disobedient sons. How many people know this? I asked. Fewer than you imagine. Most who maintain these archives never assemble the chronology correctly. They process individual documents without connecting the sequence. Those who do notice the inconsistencies usually rationalize them as clerical errors or dating system confusion. You are the 47th archivist in the last 2 centuries to be given access to the complete set. Most of them concluded nothing was wrong. A few became suspicious but found ways to explain away the discrepancies. You are the 11th to understand the pattern fully. What happened to the other 10? Varn set down his recaf. His augmetic eyes clicked as they focused on my face. 8 of them chose to continue their service, knowing what they knew, maintaining the archives that preserved the necessary lie. They understood that humanity's survival depends on certain narratives remaining intact. One retired to a monastery on Luna and took vows of silence. The last one walked into an execution chamber and volunteered for servitor conversion. He said he did not want to keep thinking about what he had learned. I felt something twist in my chest. Why show me this? Why tell me? If the lie is necessary, why let archivists discover the truth? Because someone must know, Varn said quietly. Because lies, even necessary ones, require witnesses. Because the guilt should not be borne alone by those who architect these deceptions. The Emperor made choices. Malcador made choices. I make choices every day to maintain the systems they created. And if I am the only one who knows what those choices cost, then I become either monster or martyr, and neither is true. I am simply a man maintaining a system I do not entirely believe in, because I fear what would happen if I stopped. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written in every line of his face. You will make your choice now. You can continue as I have, maintaining these archives, cataloging the documents that justify Magnus's fall while knowing the justification was constructed. You can retire to silence as others have, or you can seek the kind of ending that lets you stop thinking. These are your options. There is no fourth path. The knowledge you carry cannot be unlearned, and it cannot be safely shared. What if I go public, I asked. What if I take these documents, show the chronology, reveal the pattern? Varn smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile. The documents you found in Isolation Chamber 7 are the only copies showing those precise dates. The materials in the main archive have been corrected. The chronological impossibilities do not exist outside the files you accessed. If you attempted to reveal what you learned, you would have no evidence. You would be a delusional archivist suffering from isolation psychosis, seeing conspiracies in minor filing errors. The Inquisition would evaluate you, determine you had become unstable, and you would disappear into whatever dark place they reserve for those who know too much and speak too loudly. He stood up, walked to the window of his office that looked out over the HAB levels below. I am sorry, Severin. I was ordered to test you, to determine if you had the intellectual capacity to assemble the pattern and the psychological resilience to handle the implications. You passed the test. Now you must live with the reward. I sat in silence, feeling the weight of what he was offering me. Not a choice between good and evil, but a choice between different kinds of complicity. Continue maintaining the lie, knowing it was a lie. Retreat into silence and carry the knowledge alone, or seek erasure through servitor conversion, letting the knowledge die with my conscious mind. Did you ever ask Malcador why he did it? I said. Why he helped architect this deception? Once, Varn said. Decades ago, before he died. I was much younger then, newly awakened to what we maintain here. I found him in the archives, examining some of the very documents you processed. I asked him directly, was Magnus's fall truly necessary? Was the cost worth the outcome? He turned from the window, his augmetic eyes catching the light. He looked at me with eyes that had seen millennia pass. He said, I have asked myself that question every day for 60 years. I do not know if we were right, but I know what would have happened if we had done nothing. Humanity would have embraced psychic power without fear, without discipline, without the cautionary tale that makes the restrictions feel necessary rather than tyrannical. Within 3 generations, we would have birthed horrors that would make the Horus Heresy look like a minor rebellion. We chose to sacrifice Magnus, to burn Prospero, to create a warning written in ashes. We chose the smaller horror to prevent the larger one. I do not know if we were right. I have never known. But someone must be willing to make these choices, and better it be those who understand the weight than those who would make them lightly. Varn sat down again, heavily, as though the memory exhausted him. That is the philosophy that maintains the Imperium, Severin. The doctrine of necessary evil. The calculus that measures individual tragedy against species survival. Malcador died believing he might have been wrong. I will die believing the same. And if you choose to continue this work, you will die with that same uncertainty. What about Magnus? I asked. Does he know? Does he understand what was done to him? I do not know. Perhaps in his moment of transcendence, when Tzeentch remade him, he saw the pattern. Perhaps he still believes he failed his father through hubris and disobedience. Perhaps the truth would be crueler than the lie. What comfort is there in learning your fall was orchestrated, your loyalty exploited, your devotion weaponized? Better perhaps to believe you failed through your own weakness than to know you were constructed to fail. I thought about Magnus, wherever he was now, whatever he had become. I thought about him carrying the guilt of the Webway's destruction, believing his desperate warning had shattered his father's dream. I thought about the 1,000 sons, falling to chaos because they had been judged guilty for following encouragement that predated prohibition. I thought about the architecture of their damnation, built piece by piece, year by year, date by backwards date. The Emperor loved him, I said. I read the early communications. The affection was genuine. Yes, Varn said softly. I believe it was. That is perhaps the worst part. The Emperor loved Magnus, and still used him this way. Love and strategic calculation coexisted. The affection was real. The manipulation was real. Both were true simultaneously. That is the horror of the Emperor's nature. He is capable of genuine love and ruthless instrumentalization in the same breath. He sees his sons as beloved children and as tools for species survival, and he feels no contradiction in this. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling pieces of my worldview continuing to crumble. For 17 years I had believed in the Emperor's wisdom because it seemed pure, singular, untainted by the compromise and moral complexity that characterized lesser leaders. But the truth was worse than corruption. Corruption would have been simple, explicable, something that could be excised and reformed. This was not corruption. This was the system functioning exactly as designed by someone who understood the costs and accepted them. What about the other Primarchs? I asked. Do any of them know? Some suspect. Guilliman, I believe, understands more than he admits, though he has chosen to maintain the narrative for the same reasons we do. The Lion may have pieced together fragments during his years in the Dark Angel's hidden chambers. Dorn knew some of it, and it contributed to his later withdrawal into the Pain Glove, punishing himself for doubts he could neither confirm nor dismiss. Most of the others died or fell before accumulating enough information to see the pattern. Those who remain have made their choices about how much truth they want to pursue. Varn stood again, this time with finality. You have 6 hours to decide, Severin. At the end of that time, I will return, and you will tell me your choice. If you choose to continue, you will be promoted to second-class archivist and given expanded access to the restricted materials. You will help maintain the system, knowing what it truly is. If you choose silence, arrangements will be made for your transfer to an isolated facility where you can live out your years without speaking of what you know. If you choose erasure, the Mechanicum will handle your conversion with appropriate honor for your service. He walked to the door of his office, then paused. For what it is worth, I hope you choose to continue. The guilt is lighter when shared, and I am very tired of carrying it alone. But I will respect whatever choice you make. There are no good options here, only different kinds of survival." He left, the doors sealed behind him with a soft hiss. I sat in his office, surrounded by the warmth I had once associated with safety and authority, feeling colder than I had ever felt in the archives below. 6 hours to decide. 6 hours to choose what kind of person I would become. I thought about my 17 years of service. I thought about the pride I had taken in my meticulous work, the satisfaction of maintaining humanity's historical record with perfect accuracy. I thought about every commendation I had earned, every document I had processed, every verification I had completed. All of it had been in service of a lie. Not a minor lie, not a convenient simplification, but a foundational deception that justified the burning of worlds and the damnation of souls. I had cataloged the execution records of the 1,000 Sons. I had verified the charges against them. I had cross-referenced the evidence of their heresy against the doctrinal standards that proved their guilt. And the entire framework had been constructed backwards. They had been condemned for following instructions that predated their prohibition. They had been judged guilty for fulfilling a role designed for them. Their loyalty had been weaponized into treason by the simple expedient of reversing the chronology. How many others? How many other catastrophes, other falls, other examples had been architected the same way? How much of the Imperium's history was backward sequence disguised as causality? How many martyrs had been manufactured? How many tragedies had been staged? I thought about Magnus's final moments before his fall, desperately projecting through the warp to warn his father, believing he was violating prohibition for righteous cause, carrying the guilt of that violation even as he tried to save the Imperium, a storm. And I thought about the Emperor receiving that warning, seeing his son's guilt-ridden arrival, knowing that arrival would serve perfectly as cover for the Webway's inevitable collapse. Had there been a moment of regret? Had the Emperor felt anything watching his design come to fruition, seeing his son fulfill the role prepared for him? Or had it all been calculation, clean mathematics of species survival that left no room for sentiment? Varn's words echoed. Love and strategic calculation coexisted. The affection was real. The manipulation was real. Both were true simultaneously. I understood now why Malcador had said he did not know if they were right. Because the alternative framework, the one where Magnus was simply a tragic example of hubris and disobedience, was cleaner, easier. It allowed for moral certainty, for clear villains and victims, for righteousness and punishment. The truth was worse. The truth was that Magnus had been loved and used, that his loyalty had been exploited, that his fall had been necessary in a calculus that measured individual souls against species survival. And the worst part was that Malcador's logic almost made sense. Without the example of Magnus's fall, without the catastrophic demonstration of psychic power's dangers, humanity might have embraced warpcraft too eagerly, too broadly, too quickly. The restrictions might have seemed tyrannical rather than necessary. The discipline might have been rejected. And perhaps, as Malcador claimed, the result would have been horrors that made the heresy look minor. Perhaps. But that perhaps was the poison, because it justified anything. Any atrocity could be defended as preventing worse atrocity. Any betrayal could be framed as necessary deception. Any manipulation could be recast as strategic planning for species survival. The Emperor's calculus made him either the greatest hero in human history or the greatest monster. And the distinction between those categories collapsed under the weight of the outcomes he was willing to accept. I thought about my choice. Continue and become complicit in maintaining the lie. Retire to silence and carry the knowledge alone. Seek erasure and lose myself to preserve what remained of my innocence. None of them were good options. Varn had been right about that. There was no moral high ground here, no path that let me remain clean. I could only choose what kind of stain I would carry. I stood up and walked to the window of Varn's office, looking out over the Hab levels. Millions of people living their lives, believing in the Emperor's wisdom, trusting that the Imperium's horrors were necessary responses to external threats. They believed Magnus had fallen through hubris. They believed Prospero had burned as righteous punishment. They believed the prohibition against sorcery was wisdom learned from tragedy rather than tragedy constructed to justify wisdom. And maybe they needed to believe that. Maybe the lie was necessary. Maybe humanity's survival required narratives that were cleaner than the truth, moral certainty that was simpler than the actual calculus of power. But someone needed to know the truth. Someone needed to witness what the lie cost. Someone needed to carry the guilt so it did not simply disappear into justified doctrine. I made my choice. I returned to Isolation Chamber 7 3 hours later. I gathered the documents I had been assigned to process, the ones showing the impossible chronology, the backward sequence that revealed Magnus's orchestrated fall. I verified them one final time, checking every date, every seal, every authentication marker. Then I prepared them for transfer to the Inquisitorial Archives as originally instructed. But I also made copies, not of the documents themselves, which would be missed, but of my verification notes, my chronological analysis, my documentation of the sequence. I encoded these notes in the margin annotations of unrelated documents, using the archival notation system to record what I had found in ways that would be invisible to casual review, but recognizable to anyone who knew where to look and what pattern to search for. I hid the truth inside the lie. I buried evidence of the manipulation inside the documents that justified the outcomes of that manipulation. Future archivists, if they were thorough enough, if they were skeptical enough, if they looked carefully at marginalia in obscure files, might find what I had recorded. They might assemble the chronology. They might understand, or they might not. The odds were against discovery, but I would not be the only witness. I would not let the knowledge live and die with me and Varn and the handful of others who had learned and chosen. I would preserve the truth, however obscurely, however encoded, for whoever came after. When Varn returned, 6 hours after he had left, I told him my decision. I would continue. I would maintain the archives. I would catalog the lies and verify the backwards chronologies and preserve the documents that justified Magnus's damnation. I would do my duty, but I would also remember, and I would witness, and I would preserve the truth in whatever ways I could find. Varn looked at me with those exhausted augmetic eyes and nodded slowly. "You will be miserable," he said quietly. "Every document you process will remind you of what you know. Every verification will feel like collaboration with atrocity. You will lie awake at night questioning whether you should have chosen differently. I know this because I have lived it for 93 years. "I know," I said. "Why continue then? Why not choose silence or erasure?" "Because someone needs to witness," I said. "Because the guilt should not disappear into justified doctrine. Because if everyone who understands the truth chooses silence or erasure, then the lie becomes total. I will maintain the archives, but I will also remember what they cost." Varn studied me for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk and withdrew a data slate, different from the one he had shown me earlier. He placed it in front of me. "Your promotion is effective immediately. These are your new access authorizations. You will discover many other patterns in the restricted materials. Some of them will be worse than what you have already learned. I am sorry for that, but I am also grateful. The guilt is lighter when shared." I took the data slate. The weight of it felt like taking responsibility for 17 years of complicity, extended into an indefinite future. I thought about Magnus again, about him carrying the guilt of a failure that had been designed for him. I thought about how many other souls carried guilt for orchestrated falls, for backward sequences they had not recognized, for manipulations they had been too loyal to question. The Imperium was built on lies, necessary lies perhaps, but the necessity did not erase the deception. And someone needed to remember that beneath the righteousness and the doctrine and the justified atrocity, there were souls who had been used as tools, who had been loved and manipulated simultaneously, who had fallen into damnation as pawns in calculations they had never understood. I would be that someone. I would maintain the archives and preserve the lie and verify the documents that justified Magnus's burning. But I would also witness the truth. I would carry the knowledge of what those documents cost, what manipulations they concealed, what backwards chronologies they encoded. I would be complicit, but I would not be ignorant. That was my choice. That was what I could live with. I served as archivist second class for the next 11 years, processing restricted materials, verifying impossible chronologies, maintaining the lies that held the Imperium together. I found other patterns, as Varn had warned. I discovered other Primarchs whose falls had been orchestrated, other catastrophes whose chronologies had been reversed, other tragedies that had been manufactured to serve purposes I struggled to comprehend. I documented everything I found in marginal annotations, in encoded references, in notation patterns that preserved the truth for whoever might someday search for it. I became very good at hiding evidence inside the documents meant to conceal it. I became the kind of archivist who maintained perfect fidelity to the records while subverting their meaning through careful preservation of counter-narrative. Varn died 7 years into my new assignment. Heart failure, the medicae said, though I suspected exhaustion had more to do with it. He had carried the guilt for 93 years, and perhaps that was simply too long. They found him in the archives, surrounded by documents, his augmetic eyes still open, still focusing on pages he would never read. I became lexicanum secundus. I inherited his office, his responsibilities, his access to the deepest restricted materials. I also inherited his role of testing archivists, identifying those with the capacity to understand the patterns and the resilience to handle the implications. I have tested 43 archivists in the last 4 years. Most concluded nothing was wrong. 7 became suspicious, but rationalized the discrepancies. 3 understood the pattern fully and made their choices. 2 continue their service as I do. 1 chose silence and retired to Luna. None of them chose erasure. Perhaps we have learned to live with what we know. Perhaps the guilt has become familiar enough to be bearable. Or perhaps we simply recognize that erasing ourselves would not erase the truth, would not undo the manipulations, would not resurrect Magnus or restore Prospero or reverse any of the backwards chronologies we have discovered. I am writing this testimony now because I am dying. The medicae identified the malignancy 3 months ago, spreading through my augmented organs faster than treatment can slow. I have perhaps 6 more months. I am using that time to compile the most comprehensive record I can of what I have learned, encoding it in the deepest layers of the archival system, preserving it in ways that might survive my death and the deaths of all others who currently know the truth. This is my witness statement. This is my testimony. This is what I want preserved. Magnus the Red did not fall through hubris. He fell through architecture. The Emperor encouraged him to develop dangerous abilities, then prohibited those abilities at precisely the moment when their use would appear catastrophic. The Webway Project was unsustainable mathematics disguised as grand vision, collapsing on its own before Magnus ever arrived. The prohibition against sorcery was established before the encouragement to explore it. The verdict preceded the trial. The sequence was backwards from the beginning. Magnus believed he acted against his father's will. This was necessary. Necessary because humanity needed a cautionary tale. Necessary because psychic evolution required demonstration of danger. Necessary because the smaller horror prevented the larger one, or so they believed. Malcador died uncertain. Varn died exhausted. I will die complicit, but I will also die witnessed. The truth is preserved. The chronology is documented. The backward sequence is recorded in marginal annotations across 17,000 separate files, encoded in notation patterns, hidden inside the documents meant to conceal it. Future archivists, if they are thorough enough, if they are skeptical enough, if they care enough to look, will find what we have hidden. They will learn that Magnus was loved and used, that Prospero burned to serve purposes its inhabitants never understood, that the 1,000 suns fell into damnation as pawns in calculations of species survival, that the Emperor's wisdom was also manipulation, his love also instrumentalization, his vision also catastrophe. They will learn that the Imperium is built on backwards chronologies, on prohibitions that followed encouragement, on verdicts that preceded trials. They will learn that necessity justifies anything, and that someone must be willing to bear the guilt of necessary evil. They will learn that moral certainty is simpler than truth, and that lies, even necessary ones, require witnesses. I do not know if they will make different choices than we did. I do not know if understanding the pattern will change how they participate in the system. Perhaps they will continue as we continued, maintaining the archives while witnessing the truth. Perhaps they will choose silence or erasure. Perhaps they will find a fourth path we were too exhausted or too complicit to imagine. But they will know. And knowing is itself a form of resistance against the totality of the lie. I am Severin Ultis, Lexiconum Secundus of the Divisio Telepathica Historical Records Department, Terra. I have maintained the archives for 28 years. I have cataloged 17,000 documents related to Magnus's fall. I have verified the chronologies that justify his burning. I have preserved the lies that maintain the Imperium's moral certainty. And I have also preserved the truth. Magnus will believe he acted against his father's will. This was necessary. But was it right? I do not know. I have never known. Malcador did not know. Varn did not know. Perhaps the Emperor himself does not know, sitting upon his golden throne, maintaining a vigil that might be martyrdom or might be the harvest of his own orchestrated catastrophe. What I know is this: Magnus was perfect, and he was used. His loyalty was exploited. His devotion was weaponized. His fall was necessary. And someone needed to remember that necessity is not the same as righteousness. Someone needed to witness. I am that someone. This is my testimony. I am dead now. I have been dead for 3 months. They found me in the archives, surrounded by documents. My eyes still open, still focused on pages I will never finish reading. They will process my body according to standard protocols, review my files for anything requiring special attention, catalog my belongings, and forget me. Lexicanum Secundus is already a title held by someone else. The archives continue. The system functions. The lie maintains itself, but the truth is preserved, hidden in marginalia, encoded in notations, buried inside the documents meant to conceal it, waiting for whoever comes after with eyes to see and courage to look. If you are reading this, if you have assembled the chronology, if you have discovered the backward sequence, then you stand where I stood. You face the choice I faced. Continue and become complicit. Retreat into silence and carry the knowledge alone. Seek erasure and lose yourself to preserve innocence. Or find a fourth path. Find something we were too exhausted, too complicit, too broken to imagine. Find a way to witness the truth without maintaining the lie. Find a way to remember the cost without collaborating with the calculation. I could not find that path. Perhaps you can, but if you cannot, if you choose as I chose, then know this: the guilt is lighter when shared. The knowledge is more bearable when witnessed. You are not alone in understanding what the Imperium costs, what manipulations it requires, what backwards chronologies it maintains. Magnus was loved and used. Both were true. The horror is that both can be true simultaneously. Someone must remember that. Someone must witness what necessary evil requires, what costs it accepts, what souls it consumes in the calculus of species survival. You are that someone now. Bear witness, remember, and perhaps someday find a way to make different choices than we did. This is my testament. This is my testimony. This is what I preserved in 28 years of maintaining the lie while witnessing the truth. Magnus the Red believed he acted against his father's will. This was necessary. But was it right? The question remains. The guilt remains. The backwards chronology remains, preserved in marginalia, waiting for whoever comes after to discover and understand and choose. I chose complicity with witness. I chose to maintain the archives while encoding the counter-narrative. I chose to verify the lies while preserving the truth. What will you choose? The archives are cold, 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to preserve parchment, cold enough to see your breath when you speak the daily prayer. Cold enough to remember that beneath the righteousness and the doctrine and the justified atrocity, there are souls who paid the price for calculations they never understood. Remember them, witness them, and if you can find a way to do more than witness, find a way to resist the totality of the lie without becoming monster or martyr, then do so. I could not. Perhaps you can. That is my hope. That is what I preserve. That is the truth I hide inside the lie. The Emperor's will was served. Magnus fell as designed. Prospero burned as planned. The cautionary tale was written in ashes and backwards chronology, and someone witnessed. Someone remembered. Someone preserved the truth for whoever comes after. I am Severin Ultis. I was an archivist. I was complicit before I was a victim, complicit after I became a witness, complicit until the day I died. But I was also something else. I was a witness to necessary evil, a preserver of uncomfortable truth, a reminder that necessity is not righteousness, that love can coexist with manipulation, that the Emperor's wisdom contains catastrophe alongside vision. This is my testimony. This is what I want you to remember. The lie is necessary, but someone must know the truth. You are that someone now. Bear it well.